can't believe it. I think a Christian was here first. Am I right? Boar Machine. Hi. You get 1,000 Pine Points for being here first. Boar Machine, are you a Christian? I think you are. Welcome, welcome. I'm going to try to do something today that I haven't done before, and I'm trying to go back and forth between two videos after just going through them basically once very quickly. I'm not sure if it's going to work, but I'm going to try my best. And the whole purpose of this video is to, I think, for the Christian to have them ask themselves, what kind of Christian do you really want to be? Do you want to be a Gary Habermas type Christian? Or do you want to be a Pete Enns type Christian? Or something in between, I guess. Doesn't have to be a false dichotomy. But Gary Habermas is all about, I just have all this evidence for God and Jesus, the resurrection. And Pete Enns is the type of Christian who says, you know what? It's complicated. There's the Bible is contradictory, and there's a lot of things I don't understand. There's a lot of things I don't know. But I choose to believe in God anyway. He's that type of Christian. They're both Ph.D.s. I'll put their bios in the description box later. So Pete Enns was on T-Jump's channel just a couple hours ago. And so I got clips from that, clips from Gary Habermas on Capturing Christianity's YouTube channel. And I'm going to try to go back and forth. And I think you're going to see right away a huge difference between these two gentlemen in how they talk about God, how they talk about Jesus, how they defend it, and so forth. So welcome, glad you could join. We'll see if this works.
And they're writing and saying, you're all wrong, naturalistic theories are wrong. So 150 pages on the birth of naturalistic theories and how critics go after each one. Now that's different than me taking the individual theories and giving critiques of each one. I'm not doing hallucinations per se. I'm just doing kind of a history of.
So here, Gary Habermas is defending his, I think he said a large 5,000 page book.
Those theories for those years. So that's one example. 150 pages on David Hume and the argument against miracles. 80 pages of defense of the crucifixion alone. How do we know Jesus died? Why do almost no scholars, specialists, dispute the crucifixion? Why does John die on the cross and Marcus Borg say it's basically the strongest, most readily defensible fact in the ancient world?
Strongest, most defensible fact in the ancient world? What about Tiberius's existence? These questions that I have.
What's some of the data? So those are some of the separate things. Oh, here's another one. Some people who give evidences for the empty tomb. If you get an article, and I can name them, but the articles, I know one article that gives 8 evidences for the empty tomb, according to critical methodology, or another one gives about 10. I've got 22 evidences for the empty tomb.
He has 22 evidences for the empty tomb. Okay, so you get the gist of what he's saying. He's rattling off all these reasons to believe, all the evidence for Christianity. Now I want to give you a little flavor of a guy named Pete Enns. Listen to what he says when asked, why do you believe in God?
I'm not an apologist. I don't.
Let me slow it down a bit.
Pick ideas around on that, but I'm not an apologist. I don't think in terms of, here are the reasons why I believe, and I'll now pass this on to you, and you will now have reasons to believe too. I think that the issue, again, if there is a God, I think it's deeper, it's more subtle than that, and I don't think God. If God exists, if this universe is the work of a creator, let's say, I don't know if I can give, here are the 3 reasons why I believe in God. To me, that becomes rather nonsensical for me at that point. I do have reasons that are other reasons. There are experiential reasons, there are community-oriented reasons, there are moments I've had in my life that I might call God moments, not very many of them. But I've chosen to stay in that stream, so to speak.
And I really appreciate this honesty. Here we have someone who's very familiar with the Bible. He's very familiar with the scholarship. He's basically saying, look, why do I believe in God? Because of the experiences I've had. And I bet you this is the real reason for guys like Gary Habermas, but they can't say that. Well, maybe they do, but they will focus on all these other things, like these pages and pages of evidence and arguments and so forth. But really what it boils down to, and I always get into big doo-doo when I say this, but here's a Christian saying this. Look, it's because of the community aspect. It's because of the experiences I've had. And you notice he's using the word if God exists. He's not being overly confident saying, I know God exists. And here's why. And
to keep nurturing this faith that I have certain convictions about at times, and other times I'm a thoroughly agnostic Christian. I really just don't know. And
when's the last time you've heard a Christian say, I'm an agnostic Christian, I just don't know?
I have to say, at my age, I'm rather comfortable with that position because it just gets me out of a lot of really bad conversations I sometimes have with Christians who demand a certain way of thinking logically about the nature of God. And I think all of our talk about God is, by definition, incomplete and partial and always ready for deconstruction anyway.
Okay, now let's go back to Gary Habermas, and you'll right away hear a difference.
All critically derived, not like, well, this verse says, all critically derived verses. So there's a lot of surprises. I'll give you one more. I do a minimal facts argument, and I use basically 6 minimal facts. Well, the 2 criteria I use is that I won't use a fact that's not multiply evidenced from a bunch of different sources. And secondly, because of that, the vast majority of scholars in the 90-something percentile allow its historicity. Well, everybody grabs onto this one, everybody concedes it, and I'm almost never asked, how do you know these facts are true? So I put a list together, and if you count all the individual pieces of data that accredit these 6, it's over 100.
Okay, and I've done this many times to no avail. I don't think Christians get it when I do it, but I've done a minimal facts for Mormonism, and it's things like Joseph Smith had an experience where he believed Jesus talked to him. And Joseph Smith had an experience where he saw these golden tablets, found the golden tablets, and so forth. And I have a video on it. But basically, I have like 4 minimal facts. That there was eyewitnesses to the golden plates. Joseph Smith was just a farm boy. How could he translate these things? And for Christians, you know what they do? The first thing they do is they look at those minimal facts for Mormonism. They say, no, but you got to look at Joseph Smith's life and what he said here and here. So what they end up doing is they end up importing a whole bunch of other stuff to kind of slash the minimal facts for Mormonism. And this is what non-Christians do to the minimal facts of Christianity. They can say, yeah, sure, maybe some disciples had experiences of Jesus, but does that mean that they actually saw a risen bodily Jesus? In the same way, does Joseph Smith's experiences and maybe some of his friends who saw the golden plates, does that mean they actually saw the golden plates? Of course not.
Over 100, here's the key, critically ascertained facts that the critics would agree to. That's why the critics don't disallow the facts. We're playing their game. So those are some of the surprises in the book and some of the things I'm looking forward to their coming out.
So about 6 years ago, I learned that my brother became an atheist, and that really sent me on this journey, my original journey into apologetics. Now, when he first talked to me about this and he started to raise his objections, I had no idea if there were any evidence for even Jesus' existence, right, let alone the resurrection. And
here's Cameron Bertuzzi admitting that he had no idea that there was even evidence for Jesus' existence. Cameron, why were you a Christian then? If you had no idea about the evidence, why were you a Christian in the first place? Here Cameron's admitting that he believed in Christianity, that he became a Christian in the first place, not because of evidence. And this goes back to exactly what Pete Enns is saying, that what drives human beings to believe things is experiences first. Beliefs come first, evidence comes second.
Imagine that probably the majority of Christians are in that same position, where they just have no idea that there's this wealth of information and, as you say, data that supports a historically grounded resurrection event in history. So what is like your 5-minute spiel on the evidence in support of the resurrection? These are facts, these are historical facts, and this is what you specialize in. So
yeah. So what is the evidence, given that I had no idea that all this evidence was out there? Doesn't it seem reasonable that us fallible human beings, when we believe something and we're not exactly understanding why we believe it, but we like what we believe. In fact, we would feel foolish to not believe it if it was wrong. What ends up happening? We end up looking for evidence to confirm what we already believe. And this is the danger of biases. I'm going to try not to talk too much, and I'm going to let these two Christians go back and forth. Here's Pete Enns talking about arguments for God and how it can just go back and forth between believers and non-believers.
Oh, they may not be especially compelling to you?
Honestly, no. And I might listen to, in other words, see if people, the ontological argument or something like that for God, I'll listen. I mean, there might be something there, but for me, it's still children playing with something that...
The ontological argument, when people are arguing back and forth about this philosophical argument for God, Pete Enns is saying it's like children going back and forth.
Is far beyond our capacity to imagine, let alone understand. Again, if God is real, you know what I mean? It's like, I just need to shut up every once in a while and not think like I can wrap my arms around this. And that's why, I think for some people, it can be a helpful exercise, that kind of an apologetic. But for me, it never has been, and it's not now. Because all those things can be, there's always an argument against all these arguments. There's always something convincing that people haven't thought about. And then you just keep turning around the circularity of reasoning. And to me, that's exactly the signal of the inadequacy of those arguments for proving anything.
That's the signal for the inadequacy of those arguments for proving anything. What's interesting is I remember someone who's on the exact opposite of the Christian spectrum to Pete Enns, Seitan Brunkate. He's actually said the same thing. And he's a very conservative, presuppositional, Calvinist type Christian. And he says, look, for any argument, whether it's ontological, the cosmological, the teleological, all these philosophical arguments, there's rebuttals against them. Then you can just go back and forth like children in a playground playing with a ball, just back and forth, back and forth. And what is it really accomplishing? Okay, let's go back to Gary Habermas.
Less than 5 minutes. I start with what I call a minimal facts argument. It's a species of reliability, one of the reliability arguments, but where most reliability arguments are top-down arguments. If the book is reliable, it's like an umbrella. Everything under it gets kept, from the rain. If the book is generally true, whatever's reported under it is accurate. Mine's a bottom-up. And instead of an umbrella, I would suggest an example of a brick wall with individual facts being bricks that we put together to build a case from the bottom up. And I've used anywhere from 3 to 7 over the years. Lately, I've been doing 6. And I would say
the minimal facts change over the years, anywhere from 3 to 7 down. Now it's 6.
Jesus died by crucifixion. His disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Because of their belief that he was raised, it is the event that has turned the world upside down religiously. In fact, a recent book on non-believing Jews and the resurrection, they even acknowledge, not being Christians, that Christianity is a resurrection religion. It was the resurrection that powered the religion, powered the teachings, even to the point of being willing to die.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Isn't it reasonable? Now, I have a feeling Christians are not going to agree with this one, but isn't it reasonable to say that Jesus Christ could have not risen from the dead, and we would still see the evidence that we see? We would still see a powerful transformation of that area of the world that spread throughout the world, even though Jesus Christ never, ever rose from the dead. Now, Christians they're screaming at me, no, it's impossible. You can't have that evidence that we see now if Jesus never rose from the dead. But just think about the growth of Islam. Think about, in the United States at least, and actually worldwide, the growth of Mormonism. How could Mormonism actually have grown if Joseph Smith actually didn't talk to Jesus and have that vision? How could Islam actually have grown if Muhammad didn't speak or hear from Gabriel in that cave? How could we even have the Quran or the Book of Mormon if that didn't happen? Once the Christian can understand that, oh yeah, none of that could have happened. We could still have the Book of Mormon. We could still have the Quran. Then the next step is just to apply it to the Bible, New Testament.
And we do have first century sources for arguably the three largest names in Christianity. 4, very important, it was proclaimed very early. And today, critics, the consensus position is that you can track the resurrection preaching back to immediately after the cross. In fact, the way it's often stated by, say, Barter.
Yeah, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's true, right? Just because you can track it to, like, the writings of Joseph Smith happened very close to the events that Joseph Smith said that they happened. Okay, I'm going to go back to Pete Enns. Back to arguments.
Unlike some people who might do apologetics, I just have no fear of that. I have no concern like the other is beneath me because they're not thinking the same way that I am. I think God, if God exists, is big enough to handle all this. We're really just trying to be authentic, for heaven's sake. And that has to count for something, and not just playing a game and having a better argument and winning a debate. I have no patience with that. And then, debating is all about, I have to be right or I look dumb. It's just, okay, that's what we're doing here. That's what this is all about.
Having debates, if I'm not right, then I just look dumb. I've been saying this for a while too. It's like, if anybody, according to the teachings of the New Testament, if anybody should be willing to look dumb, it's the Christian. The gospel is foolishness to those who are perishing. In every Christian versus non-Christian debate, the Christian should basically say, I don't care if I win or lose. In fact, let's just assume I've lost already. I'm just going to preach the word of God. Humility, not trying to win. The reversal of expectations that Jesus taught, the last shall be first. Try to be last. You notice the difference between Pete Enns and Gary Habermas here. In fact, I won't rewind it. But his first thing he said is, with apologetics, Pete Enns does not fear. He doesn't have this fear like he needs to defend it. Unlike this guy. I do think with a lot of apologetics of this version, Gary Habermas's version of apologetics, I think its root foundation is fear. And what is the fear? I actually worked on this just a couple hours ago. I had a video on this. But I went through that Pew study again and refined the numbers. And the bottom line was the number of people leaving Christianity, leaving evangelical Christianity. This is Gary Habermas's version. I put in all the reproduction rates and so forth and adjusted it for deaths and stuff. And evangelical Christianity is not even holding its own. It's not even close. They're losing, over the past 10 years, they've lost a shift of at least 10 million people. This is after having kids born into Christian evangelical homes. And they're leaving. And look what's happening. 43 million people are going into nuns or atheism, agnosticism, and the rest are just bleeding out. And this is the fear. This is the basis of the fear. Guys like Gary Habermas fear the idea of people leaving Christianity. Why is leaving Christianity so bad? Why that fear? And I think it's the difference between these two gentlemen is, I think, I'm not sure, but I think Pete Enns leans universalist or annihilationism. I can't say that word. That they're annihilated when they die. He doesn't believe in the traditional view of hell. I'm quite sure of that. Whereas this guy does. And I think that's where the fear is based.
Is that when Paul said yes to Jesus on the way to Damascus, there was already a body of data called the early creeds that are later written in the New Testament, but they were already being noised abroad. When Paul said yes, there were these heavy creeds, about 80% of which are in the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, because that's a major message. They were already in existence. So when Paul didn't invent Christianity, the main reason, when he came to Christ, the message he hated most.
Paul didn't invent Christianity. There's a lot of scholars, which Christianity, I guess, is the question. You can see fights between Christian factions in the historical record.
We already have data from that 2-year period before Paul. And then the last two would be individuals, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, both of whom become Christians because they believed they had experiences which were appearances of the risen Jesus. Those are the 6 I would use. And to my knowledge, I've had dialogues with atheists, agnostics, scholars, specialists, and they don't dispute any of those.
So how do they respond to this? That you have these facts and you establish them historically, and you say the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead, right? And there are these existing naturalistic attempts of explaining away these facts.
Yep.
What is the best one to your knowledge, and then why do you think that it fails?
Someone just asked me that yesterday, and I made the point. You'd expect me to say this, but years ago, I would have told you the one that I thought was the hardest answer. Today, I would say, not only are there no good ones, there are no good theories that you can really take and ride to the bank, so to speak. If you're a naturalist, you can really take care of the resurrection with this. But the critics have generally given up espousing these theories.
Okay, so the critics have given up trying to explain the evidence that we see, naturalistic explanations. Okay, so this is a Christian historian saying there's really no good naturalistic explanations for the data, the evidence we have for Jesus rising from the dead. Except, here's a Christian named Pete Enns, who's a scholar, is he a historian? Does he call himself a historian? I'm not sure. But I'm going to skip ahead here, and he's going to give a naturalistic explanation as a Christian. Let's see if I can find it here.
That this is how this faith would start. Now, it could be, for example, of course, I can deconstruct all this stuff all day if I want to, but it could just be that the New Testament writers are grasping at something to make sense of Jesus's death, right? And this is just telling us what they might believe in a desperate moment. Yeah, I mean, that's a possible scenario. I can't say that's impossible to think that way. So, I'd want to think more about that. And again, I do think about that internally. I have these conversations I'm having a great conversation by myself right now, right? I think about this stuff a lot. And but yeah, anyway.
So Pete Enns is saying, okay, there's this guy named Jesus. He was a leader of a group of people, and he died. And his followers are desperately trying to make sense of his death. And so how did we get Paul's letters? How did we get the Gospels? Well, Pete Enns goes on here to explain a naturalistic explanation for the data we see. Let me fast forward it here.
I don't know if I'm or not, but I do sometimes think like the New Testament writers, okay, they believe Jesus rose from the dead. That's easy. That's a wonderful thing to have happen. But why die that way? Why die at all? Well, we're now going to enter into the language of Leviticus and of the Old Testament of their tradition, which is the only language they have. And I think
so. Pete Enns is giving a naturalistic explanation of, okay, we have Jesus, he died. How his followers have to make sense of this. What happens? They go to the Old Testament to reinterpret what just happened because they thought, okay, here's Jesus, the Messiah. He's not supposed to die.
I think what we're seeing here is a reasoning process. Well, that death must have meant something, and it must be for the benefit of others. And then when you realize that, I mean, the New Testament writers don't make that up. You see this in Jewish literature of the Second Temple period, like 100 years, 200 years before Christ, where the blood of the martyrs actually atones for the sins of the people as a whole. And even you see this in Second Isaiah, for example, what's called the fourth servant song, like Isaiah 52 and 53, where the servant suffers on behalf of the people. Well, the servant is obviously Judah in exile. It's not one person. It's not Jesus. So you have this notion of the blood of some atoning for the sins of others, but it's still a different thing in the New Testament with Jesus. But my point is that they have language to explain why that had to happen the way that it did.
They had language to explain why it had to happen the way it did, why Jesus had to die, and that is they used the Old Testament as a building block, as a foundation to reinterpret what their experiences, to make sense of their experiences. And you can see that clearly in especially in the Gospels that were written later. Okay, let's go back to Habermas.
An article some years ago where I argued that less than 25% of the critics in the last 25 years, about less than 25% use the naturalistic theories anymore. They will usually say something like this. Yeah, facts are good. I don't agree it's your idea is the only way to go. But, you've got an evidence case. And if you pushed them a little bit and said, well, what keeps you from believing the stuff yourself?
Can I guess?
So good. Go ahead.
Hume.
Well, Hume, but I think generally they'll say, I just don't want to believe.
Really?
And they will say miracles don't happen, and that say that they know you're ready. They don't often want to take you on. Another comment is, yeah, but you got a problem with your theory. What's that? Well, you got some data for your theory, and I'm not exactly sure where I would go to refute it. But you're asking me, implicit in your argument is you're asking me to believe in Middle Earth, Narnia, or if you want a secular example, Oz. You're asking me to believe in that. And there's no world like that. How do you know? Well, there's no, look, everything we know from empirical science, there's not an ultimate universe. And when I'm talking to a person like that, I always go, time out. Let's talk about near-death experiences.
Okay, let's talk about near-death experiences. See, this is amazing to me because a guy like Gary Habermas, who was just bragging, I'll use the word bragging, just bragging, listing all the evidence for the resurrection, the minimal facts and so forth. And the common critique is, well, look, you're asking me to believe in Narnia. You're asking me to when I go home and sit on my couch and I turn on the TV and I see a giant green lizard destroying a city, you're asking me to say that this is the History Channel and not the Sci-Fi Channel. That's what you're asking me to do. And Gary Habermas says, well, wait a minute, time out. Let's talk about near-death experiences, shall we? He's trying to lay a foundation of the supernatural, because if we can establish that the supernatural is real, then hey, that brings Narnia into play. That brings the green lizard into play. That brings Jesus' resurrection into play. But you notice the difference between Pete Enns. Pete Enns is saying, no, the naturalistic explanation here is you don't even have to go to the supernatural realm. The naturalistic explanation is this is a story built upon the Old Testament amongst followers of Jesus who are trying to make sense of what just happened. That the person that they love dearly is now gone, and they weren't expecting that. Okay, I'm gonna rewind it here a little bit. I'm jumping back and forth, but this is such a refreshing admission by Pete Enns here. I wanted to play this.
God exists. God understands that too, and how, if I were born in a different time and place, I wouldn't be Christian. I don't know what I would be. Who knows? I mean, if I were born in another continent, another time.
See, now, if I was to say something like this, you're only a Christian because you were born, I shouldn't use the word only, but it's more likely that you're a Christian because you were born in the United States. And I could say the same thing about me. I'm more likely to be an atheist because I was born in the United States versus Pakistan. I'd probably be a Muslim. But it gets to bias, right? It gets to, we have to be aware of the influences in our life that causes belief.
And again, if God exists, I cannot imagine a God who would be vindictive or retributional, for example, because of that set of affairs, right? So, and I'm not the first person to say that. People have been saying that in the Christian faith for pretty much since the beginning, these strands of it. And part of my own process, my own spiritual formation, as we call it, has been getting into some communication with traditions beyond, evangelicalism or some form of biblicism, right? So, and that's
he's talking about Gary Habermas here, is to try to get beyond the Gary Habermases of the world.
Sort of nice to know the Christian faith is actually fairly broad. It's not as narrow as, let's say, the discipline of apologetics can sometimes make it out to be.
Yeah. Now, I get accused often of just focusing too much on the Gary Habermas type of Christian. But I do that for a reason. Number one, because I enjoy it. It's almost easy. Now, the problem with the Pete Enns type of Christianity, it's hard to push back against it because he's admitting, I don't know. You notice how he often says, if God exists. He's not dogmatic by any sense. He's basically saying, hey, I'm trying to get through this world. I exist and I'm trying to make it. And the world is tough. And this belief brings me, my experiences bring me comfort, and the belief in Jesus and Christianity, I believe, makes me a better person, but that doesn't mean that it has to be that way. He's being authentic and real. And I just see apologists like Gary Habermas, which I think he's more of an apologist than a historian. It's like you sense this fear, like this, we have to defend this, otherwise we're going to lose everything. We're going to lose the moral fabric of society and that sort of thing. And we're going to lose salvation.
And because the evidence has been coming in so well, in a recent book, up to 30 million people in North America, England, and Europe have claimed to have near-death experiences. So I could say, hey, let's just say the number's blown up too much and there's only 20 million. In a way, that's 20 million people who've been to Narnia, if you want to look at it that way. So don't tell me there's no empirical evidence for this. And they'll say, yeah, those are just experiences. You don't have data. Well, you don't say that to me. I just gave a paper yesterday. I know of 300 evidenced NDE accounts where what's reported is empirically verified. So
300 evidence NDE, near-death experience accounts. What someone who values truth would ask at this point is, out of all the near-death experiences on this planet, why aren't all of them pointing to a God, the Christian God? That's something they have to explain. Or better yet, out of all the people who have died and come back to life, why don't all of them have a near-death experience? Why do some of them just, they're out, then they're back, and that's it? And their memory, they don't remember anything special. Why is that? Why is it only some people, in fact, the vast minority of people, have these experiences, and why do they correlate with their culture often? Now, he's going to give an example, and I already have heard this one and have talked about it, but I'll play it again.
If you can't refute it, and it's almost impossible to refute the NDEs, if you can't refute them, and you have...
It's almost impossible to refute the NDEs, then what value is it? If you can't falsify a belief or a claim, what value is it?
This alternate reality, in what category? In the category of afterlife. Oh, so there may be an afterlife. Well, I didn't think so until today, but yeah, I guess maybe there is. Okay, now can we talk about resurrection? See, because I've opened the door to talk about this alternate reality, which may last forever, and you can't say anymore, yeah, but you're asking me to believe in Oz, because I would say, I sure am, and I've got data for Oz.
Yeah, and this is why guys like Michael Licona are different than Pete Enns, is because of the flying trash can lid, a lot of you have heard of, and the experiences that Michael Licona has had in his life. I think this, as Pete Enns said, these experiences color how you look at the evidence.
So this is probably the most common objection I hear from atheists, and I do a lot of stuff online, Facebook and everything. And the one thing that they say that I see a lot is any naturalistic explanation you can think of is going to be more probable.
That's smarter. I mean, that's a lot of guys.
Is your response?
No, that is this objection, because what they're saying is disciple stole the body is a lousy objection, but it's better than yours because stolen bodies happen in this world, resurrections don't. What he's saying is there's not another world from which Jesus was a strange visitor to this planet.
Yeah, and the thing is, most unbelievers like myself would never say the Jesus' body was stolen, but I would agree it's more likely that a man rose from the dead. But the naturalistic explanation is what Pete Enns just said, is that this is a story. That people, when it's written down that 500 people saw the risen Jesus, I used to go to a Pentecostal church, and I tell you, there's people today who have seen Jesus and have experienced Jesus. In fact, there's many Pentecostal churches where I bet you could find 500 people who exit the building at 12:05 p.m. who will tell you, I experienced the risen Jesus. Does that mean they actually saw Jesus in the flesh, ate with him, supped with him? Of course not.
To begin his missionary efforts on earth from his Father's right hand. There's no other world. So when they say, any other theory is more logical, it's not because they're not saying what a lot of Christians think they are. They're not saying all of my theories have better evidence than yours. They're not. They're saying you got some data there, but you asked me to believe in a crazy place and people can rise from the dead, and we don't have any other examples. So chances are you're wrong. And I'd say, all right, 30 million people who claim to have NDEs. 300 of them are evidence.
NDE, just to make sure the audience is understanding, NDE means near-death experience.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
And if I have 300 cases, and if I start telling you the examples right here, the most incredible ones, people go, "Oh my gosh, that's really happened." Yeah, it's recorded.
I can already tell people are wondering, well, what? Like, give me a taste. Give me one of these.
Okay, the example he's going to give is the one Licona asked, and Licona asked, "Give me your best example," and I think this is the best example.
But before I do that, let me tell you one thing: how people are just missing the whole realm. A fellow just retired from University of Virginia Medical School. He's probably the leading NDE expert. His name is Bruce Grayson. As far as I know, not a Christian.
Okay.
In fact, Bruce told me one time he'd gone to the East for these studies, so maybe Buddhism or something. I don't know. I can't speak for him. But Bruce himself has published 100 peer-reviewed near-death articles in medical and psychological journals. So people go, you're talking about cartoons, man. It's like SpongeBob, he lives in a pineapple under the sea. Yeah, right. That's why it was written up in 100, that's why 100 articles written up in medical journals. So
Yeah,
you're just
that's
not
why
reading the data.
yeah.
And so we'd have to go to the evidence cases. Okay, here's a couple examples. Fast ones. Some of them take a while to develop, but a couple fast ones.
And you're writing a book on this, right? So people can go to, no?
I've got a book with chapters in it, and I just debated a guy on this subject. He doesn't believe in them. I do. It's published by Blackwell, and he and I just debated, and I have probably 30 of these cases. Evidential cases divided into 5 evidential categories.
Well, give me these 2.
Yeah, here's a couple. This woman has
This woman, what is her name?
she's being operated on. She has a near-death experience. She's up above her body. She's looking
What's the date?
down. She's watching herself. And sometimes they don't even know it's them because they identify with who's up by the ceiling. That's their point of consciousness. And on the top of this,
Where did this happen? Where's the hospital? By the way, as far as I know, there's no answers to the question that I'm asking. What is this woman's name who actually died? Maybe there is answers to these questions, but I have searched the internet for them and I couldn't find them. There's the woman who's reported these things, her name, but as far as the details, it's very scant.
this medical device that was in the room, hospitals often rivet numbers like offices do to keep track of typewriters and to keep track of things. She looked down and there was a 12-digit number riveted onto the top of this medical thing. And she said,
What was the 12-digit number? What were the exact numbers and letters? Do we have record of that?
I'm OCD. And so I memorized the 12-digit number. And so she comes to, she says to the nurse, write this down. Now, I'm not saying this is a number, but it's like, write this down, 675-21600.
Now, those weren't the exact numbers. He's just making it up because unless he memorized it. But when he talked to Lycona, he didn't give any specific examples. And as far as I know, now I could be wrong about this, but there's no record of this nurse writing a number down, dating it and signing it or anything like that. There's no official record of this.
12 numbers. And the nurse wrote it down. And they were later moving the apparatus out of the room. And the nurse jumps in and says, whoa, wait a minute. Let me get my sheet out. Wow, the number's exactly right. Now, she sees that in a state, and many of these people, when you have a cardiac arrest with ventricular fibrillation, this particular species of cardiac arrest, you have no measurable heart waves, and within an average of 15 seconds, you have no brain waves. So if she was out of her body for as long as 5 minutes, she theoretically has no heart or brain waves. How does she know to repeat that data? How does she know what's up there?
Yeah, and how do we know that anything you're saying is true? That's the problem. I would admit that would be amazing if we had some data like that. But as far as I could tell, in the research I've done, and I did like a couple weeks ago, I could not find the woman's name, the hospital where this took place, any record that these numbers were written down, any record that these numbers matched this machine. What was the machine that she saw? A lot of these details we just don't know.
So that's one. Well, evidence one. Boy, people ask me, they'll say, well, I'll say, what kind of evidence do you want? I'll give you. Another one is a real fast one.
Okay, let's go back to Pete Enns, back to this a little more sanity. The question arrived at, or Tom made the comment, one of the reasons why he does not believe in the Christian God, and it was the problem of suffering. And Pete Enns' answer was very, very refreshing to me, because it's not like what you'll hear from the average apologist like Gary Habermas.
Yeah, and I think no matter how many people claim to have solved the problem of evil and suffering, I don't think it's been solved. And I'm thinking here just on the top of just on my feet here, but I keep coming back to that, and I don't know if there's a bigger problem. So I think we would agree that this is a serious problem.
So how many times have you heard apologists like Habermas? No, I don't know. I'm not saying Habermas have said this, but apologists like Habermas is saying, "Oh no, the problem of evil and suffering, it's been solved intellectually. Of course, it's just the emotional thing that's really just doesn't count that much."
I don't have an answer for it. What I do think about, though, and I could be wrong about this. Maybe some of the people watching this will know better than I do, but
when's the last time you've heard Gary Habermas saying, "I could be wrong about this"? Seriously, if you are a fan of Gary Habermas, let me know, when's the last time you've heard Gary Habermas say what Pete Enns just said?
Though, and I could be wrong about this. Maybe some of the people watching this will know better than I do, but I don't know of another faith that somehow claims that God participates in shameful suffering. And that is the Christian faith. That is, New Testament theologians talk about how if you're going to start a religion in the first century in the Greco-Roman world with an honor-shame culture, you don't align your God with Roman crucifixion in any way, shape, or form. And yet that's such a powerful thing in the New Testament that we are participating in Christ's suffering. He participates in ours. And somehow that's going to work itself out towards something big and beautiful.
Yeah, and this is something that Pete Enns, I think, agrees with the Gary Habermas. Gary Habermas would say this. He would say that the problem of suffering has been solved, I think, but they both admit that Christianity helps people through suffering, and that's the key. Like, suffering exists, everybody agrees with that, and Christianity is maybe the best religion to help people through suffering. I'm not saying that's the case, but...
I had surgery. He was up above his body watching the doctors do this, but he got maybe a little bored. I don't know.
Hypothesis is.
Sure.
And it's the second part of the Bayesian probability. So can I put this in terms of like, I'm going to use a technical term here, Bayesian probability. Okay, so we're talking later on about like what the evidence suggests. That's the second part of the equation. The first part is what the prior probability of the hypothesis is.
Sure.
And it seems like that's what you're trying to raise.
Yeah,
the
now
prior
somebody said, when Richard...
Yeah, and this is why Gary Habermas is talking about near-death experiences and why Michael Licona talks about flying trash can lids during a seance, is because they're trying to raise the prior probability that there's a spiritual realm. But a lot of intelligent Christians would admit that that gets you no closer to saying, even if there's a God, even if there's a spiritual realm, the evidence is overwhelming that if this God just doesn't desire to raise people from the dead, he just doesn't do it very often, if at all. And so the prior probability, before you look at the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, why would a God care about Jesus? Now, Christians are flipping out, like, well, because he's God and blah, 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 and he's God's son, and he's this Messiah. Well, wait a minute. We're trying to raise the prior probability that this God would even desire to do this. Camille Gregor questioned Blake Giunta on this question recently, and we asked for his best piece of evidence why Yahweh would want to raise Jesus from the dead. And he said something because of his impact on the world later. And then later, and because basically Jesus was famous and he impacted the world in a positive way, so that would mean God would want to raise him. The prior probability should go up a little bit. No, think of the second most famous or influential person. He mentioned Muhammad. And even Blake admitted at the end of it, oh, that's probably a posterior evidential thing because of the influence on the world later. It doesn't raise the prior probability. So Blake's best reason why Yahweh would even care to raise Jesus, he admitted, no, that's not a reason at all.
Swinburne does this argument. He puts God's existence. He's written a whole technical great book on God's existence, but he still puts that probability low for those who think it's low, and he still gets, I think, 97% for the resurrection. Well, if you have some things up front, let's just give two: God's existence and an afterlife. Well, how do you know afterlife? Well, I didn't say eternal life. I just said this person was still functioning 3 hours after their NDE, because some of the cases are kind of long. If you start with God and an afterlife, which atheists are often say those are the two planks they have to get rid of to be an atheist, God and an afterlife. If you start with those, yeah, you're going to raise the price.
Actually, I do think, I could be wrong about this, but I do think there are some atheists, crazy atheists out there who believe in an afterlife without believing in a God. So I don't know if you have to link those two.
Higher probability that the likelihood that a resurrection actually happened.
So I've been wanting to ask a historian this question for a long time now. And what is... It's another common objection that I see is that most probably Jesus' body would have been thrown into a mass grave. So my question is, what is the earliest historical evidence we have of Jews criminals being thrown into a mass grave? Does it come at the time of Nero, around 70 AD, or does it come before then? Because it seems to me like that's the earliest evidence that we have of these mass graves.
Okay, first of all, you're going to be hard put to nail exact historical references when it was done. But I would concede, and many would, that that's what happened to most people, not necessarily mass graves, but a little...
Yeah, so most people were put in a mass grave, but Jesus was special.
A little classier would be a rectangular square in the ground, like today, only without a casket. And you put the body on top of it and cover it up. That would be kind of a classy one. A mass grave would be, garbage, in a garbage heap or something. But it's a totally moot point. It's a totally moot point because, like I say to people, let's take your theory. Give me your best shot. What do you want to say? They put it in a garbage dump, and by Sunday, it was already burned up from the smoldering ashes that were always burning.
Or dogs may have eaten it.
Dogs may have eaten it. And I'll just go, that's cool. So what's wrong? Well, I don't know. The gospel story of Joseph is incorrect, or part of it is. He may have been the one that put him in the common grave, but for the most part, the gospel story would be wrong. And I'd say...
Joseph of Arimathea.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd say...
Yeah, is Joseph of Arimathea, is that a minimal fact that he even existed? That town of Arimathea even existed? Is that a minimal fact? Like a guy like Pete Enns would say that Joseph of Arimathea, he doesn't say it in this video, but I'm a betting man, and I bet a guy like Pete Enns would say, look, the Joseph of Arimathea character was made up to parallel Isaiah 53, that Jesus would be buried by the rich with the rich.
Okay, so what do you have here? You got a moot point. You picked a horrible example because Jesus could have died on Friday, been thrown in a trash heap, had his body eaten and or burned or both, and guess what's going to happen Sunday? What if he appears anyway? What if the parts of that body were transformed? I mean, to give an example.
So Gary Habermas is basically saying it doesn't matter whether it's moot. It doesn't matter if he was put in a mass grave or not. He still rose from the dead. What he's admitting is that idea of an empty tomb doesn't really matter, because whether he was put in a tomb or a mass grave or a pit, he still could have risen from the dead. And it doesn't matter if his body was eaten by dogs. And if there was only one piece of hair of Jesus left and dogs ate the rest, even the bones, there's only one piece of hair left. My God's big enough to raise Jesus from the dead on that one piece of hair.
Well, what about a Christian who's fishing, falls into the ocean, gets eaten by a shark? Will he have nothing to be raised at the last day? Oh, no, God can give him a new body. Okay, well, it's irrelevant whether Jesus was in the tomb, where they took the body and put it in somebody's...
You hear what's happening here? He's arguing against himself in a way. He's basically saying, who cares about the empty tomb? Doesn't matter. God can raise Jesus from the dead no matter where he was placed.
Living room, whether it was in a trash heap. If Jesus is going to rise, he can rise in your living room. What if all the disciples come running to your house because he's there and you have tea time, with Jesus? A little different story, but in your home. So it doesn't do anything to the resurrection message.
It doesn't do anything, except it strokes off one of your minimal facts that you use to defend it. Okay, let's go back to Pete Enns. One thing that I've often said is that the gospel is foolishness to those who are perishing, yet guys like Habermas and Cameron Bertuzzi are trying to make the gospel and the evidence not foolish. They're trying to make it reasonable. They're trying to make a man walking on water, rising from the dead. They're trying to make it say, oh, it's very plausible given the evidence and given that there's a God. But that goes against their own scriptures that, look, it's foolishness. Anybody who has not been regenerated, does not have the Holy Spirit, how can you expect them to believe this stuff? Even guys like Seitan Bruggencate admits this. Now listen to Pete Enns here. I love this. This is why I do this, because it's so much fun.
It started with the overturning of, the Beatitudes, the blessed are the poor. Those who are the lower, they're the ones who are blessed. And to me, I guess what I'm getting at is the paradox of the Christian faith, which I think is very fundamental to it, is...
Paradox, a nuanced way of saying contradictory.
Just enough to keep me saying, wow, I wouldn't have thought of this, actually, as a faith system, let's call it. And it's very attractive to me. I don't mind telling you that. The irrationality of it, I'm not like Kierkegaard now, but the irrationality of it to me is very attractive, because all the other stuff, it's just you're propping up these pieces to make it all fit. And I think the pieces just come tumbling down when confronted with the cross.
This is gorgeous. Here we have a Christian, Dr. Peter Enns, saying the irrationality of the gospel message. He absolutely loves the paradox and the irrational part of it. Whereas guys like Gary Habermas is saying, look, you're not crazy for believing this. Look at all the evidence we have. You're not crazy. It all makes sense. The evidence, the minimal facts. This is very rational stuff. You're very rational for believing this. And Pete Enns is saying, no, it's the irrationality that I love.
I think the Orthodox view is that it was his body, but changed. And of course, the evidence of the wounds, most probably in the wrists, and elsewhere, the wounds may be still in the head from crown of thorns or lashing. It's still there, so it's his body, but it's changed. And changed how? How much? Well, there's all kinds of arguments about that. But the Jewish view, the predominant Jewish view of that time, is that the body is what's raised. The body is changed.
The body is what's raised, but the body is changed. So is it the same body or not? Well, yeah, it's the same body. It's just different. Well, how different?
Physical body.
Yeah, let me give you an example. If somebody has a mole right here, will they have a mole right here on the resurrection body? Oh, that's silly. It's like it's irrelevant.
It's silly. It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Well, if your body has a mole there and your resurrection body doesn't, what if your resurrection body doesn't have an arm or a head or a torso? Is it your body? What does it matter? Why even use the word body at that point? Habermas is basically saying that even though Jesus showed the holes in his hands according to the story, that's irrelevant because his body was changed. This is why there are Christians today who are against cremation because of this. Because how is God going to resurrect ash? We need some body to resurrect in order to have a resurrection body. But if there's no problem for Yahweh to resurrect a bunch of ashes, then what's the big deal with resurrecting Jesus' body at all? You could have cremated Jesus on the cross, just lit him up until he's a bunch of ash, and God could have still resurrected him because there's, I guess, some DNA left. Like, does God need a little bit of DNA in order to resurrect?
I just want to know that I'm there and I would like my body back. According to biology.
And I'll say this, I've said this before, but the redemption of mankind, according to Christianity, is from the resurrection, the death and resurrection of a piece of meat. Because most Christians believe that Jesus' soul, his spirit, did not die. But in order to have salvation, redemption, for Christians like Gary Habermas, you need meat, just the shell, the body, to come back to life. I love that. The redemption, the resurrection, the salvation in Christianity is about the resurrection of a piece of meat.
The body you have in 20 years is not the body you have now anyway.
Maybe this is a perfect time to talk a little about the Shroud of Turin. Are you convinced that that's authentic?
I'm fairly convinced. I would say mid to low probability. I just told somebody over lunch today that I would put probability for the Shroud at 60 to 80.
60 to 80%. Here we have a Ph.D. historian who thinks the Shroud is 60 to 80%. He said mid to low probability. 60 to 80% is not low to mid probability to me.
5%, depending on what kind of mood I'm in.
Okay.
And I'm just saying that to accent the fact that we all have interpretations of data.
So a brief overview of what the Shroud is.
It's a linen cloth, 3-to-1 weave, a little over 14 feet.
See, this is what I think Pete Enns was talking about with the fear factor. It's like, I have all this evidence in the New Testament and extra biblical evidence and minimal facts, but you know what? Let's throw in NDEs, near-death experiences. Let's throw in the Shroud of Turin just for good measure. And I tell you, we got a rock-solid case.
Long, a little over 3 feet wide. And it buries a body. If the body's inside.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There's a Canadian accent. I'm sorry, but this is just so ridiculous to me. I got to go back to Pete Enns. Here's Pete Enns talking about the Bible and how it's contradictory. Here's a Christian who just admits it. It's so refreshing. Let's see if I can find it here.
So I look at it. What I like about the contradictory nature of the Bible, and it's clearly almost ubiquitously, at least diverse, if not flat out contradictory.
He's admitting the Bible is flat out contradictory.
Is because it's written by people. And people living at different times in different places under different circumstances. You have contradictions within Torah because there are different traditions that are probably separated by, if not generations, if not even centuries. And I just find that a very humanizing, affirming thing that is consistent, let's say, with Christian theology, which has as its core something incarnational.
Okay, so here's Pete Enns basically saying he's okay with contradictions in the Bible. A guy like Gary Habermas and Cameron Bertuzzi, they can't say that. If the Bible's contradictory, I think they have to fight against this. I think they have to harmonize things, because if they don't, it's like, how can they trust what it says? And here's that fear and the uncertainty that I think guys like Gary Habermas are not comfortable with. They don't like to be ensconced in that uncertainty, where a guy like Pete Enns, he's totally fine with it. I'm okay with that uncertainty.
Right. So I think that, again, if God exists, I'm going to stop saying that. I believe God exists, but you know what I mean, but I don't know what I mean by that. Right. Okay, fine. So, I don't think that I don't think a scripture that is contradictory and is sort of moving in certain directions, sometimes different directions at once, and sometimes they're not even reconciled. I don't think a scripture that's so fundamentally human is at all at odds with a book that has been like a non-negotiable partner for both Judaism and Christianity for over 2,000 years. I don't think it has to be one or the other. And that's why things, in terms of apologetics, there's nothing that irritates me more is people trying to smooth over the Bible and making it into something that it's not. There are things that clearly cannot be reconciled. And
Things that clearly cannot be reconciled.
Jews get this. You see, Christians have a hard time with this, but I think Jews have a much easier time reconciling the fact that there are laws in Torah that say very, very different things that can't be reconciled.
So why can Jews and guys like Pete Enns be okay with this clearly contradictory nature of fallible human beings writing texts, and I think guys like Gary Habermas, I'm not 100% sure his position on inerrancy, and they even define that word so differently. But I think I understand Mike Lacona's position, and I guess Mike Lacona's position on inerrancy is similar to Gary Habermas, and they kind of say the Bible is inspired and it doesn't make any errors. However, it uses language and so forth that it really looks like an error, but really it isn't.
Like a pen right here. The cloth is a 14-foot cloth that wraps around it.
Oh, he's still talking about the shroud. I tell you, it's been carbon dated. I don't understand. If you're a Christian and you believe the shroud is more likely than not authentic, my advice is don't let non-believers know that you believe that. Keep that to yourself. Okay, I'm going to fast forward. I don't know where this is going, but
like you couldn't have burned the image in there.
Well, picture a thread having 200 fibrils. That's how small the fibrils are. It's very shallow. And don't give me the argument. He's a Christian, but he said, don't give me the argument that we can't explain the shroud because that's just nothing. There's a lot of things we can't explain. So we can't explain the pyramids. And I said, yeah, but there's a little bit of a difference here. You can make a pyramid today. You cannot make the Shroud of Turin.
So let's go to two last questions before we have to end this out. Two questions on mythicism. Okay, the first one has to do with 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul's talking about the resurrection. Mm-hmm. Some mythicists say that Paul was really talking not about a bodily, physical resurrection, but about a spiritual resurrection in heaven somewhere. What's your take on that in 1 Corinthians 15?
A couple of general responses. These would unpack, these two would unpack to 6 or 8 if I developed them. But the two.
Do you have this in your book?
Which one? The big one? It's in almost everything I do in the resurrection.
Okay.
So two big responses. Number one, there's the most important point. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that Paul said Jesus really appeared as a glorified, disembodied spirit. Let's just say that was Paul's view.
Okay.
The point is, there's still a resurrection. And if the Bible taught a Platonic view, that at death we shed our bodies, we flee off to the heavens, disembodied, and able to live in bliss because throughout eternity we can live together and continue to acquire knowledge. That Platonic kind of view, which dominated the church up until the late Middle Ages. If that was Paul's view, you would still have a glorious resurrection view for both Jesus and us. So my point is, if that's what the New Testament taught, that's what all of us would believe, and nobody would be upset with it. We'd all say, this is a really cool view. So you get nowhere by doing that kind of theory because you still have a resurrection. Second response,
I don't know. I don't even know what to say about that. It's like, it doesn't matter if Paul said it was a spiritual resurrection because you still have a resurrection. Is that what he's saying?
For a variety of reasons, it's very clear that Paul believed in the resurrection of the body. He's not teaching resurrection of the spirit.
I guess not.
In 1 Corinthians 15. He's teaching, for example, whenever Paul talks about the resurrection of the dead, it's always in the plural. Because Jewish eschatology is that the righteous dead would be raised together. Well,
when did Paul see Jesus in the body according to the story? Or according to the historical narrative? When? Now, I think a lot of Christians would say this was years after the ascension, according to Acts, that Paul had this Damascus Road experience much later after Jesus rose from the dead. So if you're a Christian and you're waiting for the second coming, you're wrong. You're waiting for the third coming, because the second coming is when he came back to see Paul in the body.
It doesn't quite work with I can't say corporate. It doesn't quite work with a bunch of spirits to be raised together. It's more of a bodily event to be raised together. Paul says Philippians 3.
And this is why in Matthew 27, it talks about the saints of old coming out of their graves and walking, which Michael Licona doesn't believe actually happened in history. But Gary Habermas is painting a picture of this Jesus' resurrected body being more of a corporate thing, although he didn't like to use the word corporate. So if Matthew 27 is fictional, maybe, or allegorical, or metaphorical, then maybe Jesus' resurrection bodily resurrection is metaphor and allegorical and not literal, as guys like John Dominic Crossan would say.
God will change our vile soma, body, to be like unto his glorious soma. He could very easily, by changing one simple word, say he's going to change our vile soma to be like unto his glorious pneuma, spirit. Doesn't. He says body. So those are just a couple of reasons. Over and over, Paul's anthropology is a bodily anthropology. So I think the orthodox view of Jesus being raised in a body, even on Paul, it's certainly clear in the Gospels, but even Paul held to bodily resurrection. But we're not getting anywhere.
I like that he admitted that it's certainly clear in the Gospels. He's at least admitting that it's not as clear with Paul's letters.
Where it's like the body in the grave thing. It sounds funny, and they think they're going to get to first base by trying to trap you on something, but it doesn't disprove resurrection, so why waste your time?
Trying to trap you. See, there's an indication. A lot of Christians get upset with me that I'm trying to trap them. And Habermas is saying, critics are trying to trap you. It's like, I'm going to be forthright here. Christians, what's wrong with you? Christians like Habermas, what is wrong with you? Why are you scared of being trapped? This is that fear thing that Pete Enns was mentioning earlier. Why are you so scared of looking foolish? The gospel is foolishness to those who are perishing. Why are you worried about being trapped? A Christian should not care one bit what kind of questions I ask them that seem like a trap, and that they have to be very careful. Because it's in God's hands, they have the truth on their side. It's actually quite comical to me. Okay, let's go back to Pete Enns. And I tell you, if anything you get from this video is the contrast between these two Christians. I think they both love Jesus, but they're so different. The type of Christianity that they espouse is so incredibly different, and how they interact with non-believers is so incredibly different. Gary Habermas, in my opinion, is defensive, fearful. Don't trap me. This is true. Minimal facts. NDEs, Shroud of Turin. I got all this stuff. What do you have, you naturalists? And Pete Enns sounds more like this.
To be augmentable, never have to be adjusted in any way, shape, or form. Almost like a math formula. Those things really irritate. You're doing therapy now, Tom. I don't know if you realize that, but it really does irritate me to see people actually disrespect the text so much that they make it all harmonized and say the same thing. Don't you dare do that.
They try to.
Well, they try to, exactly.
So Pete Enns is talking about Gary Habermas right now. Apologists like Gary Habermas, where they disrespect the text, the New Testament, and the Bible in general, when they try to harmonize everything, trying to make it fit, trying to make it work.
Or they assume it should be that way. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, as long as those people don't sign my paycheck, I don't really care too much, but because they used to. But
yeah, Michael Licona definitely cares. This is the thing. People like Gary Habermas, apologists, historians, actually, I'm not sure with Gary Habermas, but there's a lot of scholars, conservative, evangelical, born-again scholars, who their paycheck is determined by their beliefs. Like if they change their beliefs on certain things, if they were to say, oh, no, there is no real hell, or Jesus didn't appear to Paul in bodily form, their job could be on the line if this gets out. No, the Bible is contradictory. No, the New Testament has errors in it. A lot of conservative evangelicals would lose their job if they let that out.
I think it's not a perspective of faith ironically. I think that's a perspective of fear.
Yeah, it's perspective of fear.
To first base by trying to trap you on something, but it doesn't disprove resurrection, so why waste your time?
So what is, in your mind, the fastest way to disarm a mythicist? Someone who thinks that there is no historical figure that was Jesus living back 2,000 years ago.
Because
What's the best way to disarm a mythicist? I want to be very clear here. How do I say this? Almost everyone on this planet is a Christ mythicist. Did you hear me? Almost everyone on this planet, the majority, let's put it that way, the majority of people on this planet are Christ mythicists. There's even some Christians who are Christ mythicists, believe it or not. What we're talking about here is Jesus and whether he existed or not. And for the most part, most people think, yeah, some minimal figure, a guy named Jesus walked on this planet at one time.
I've got a book called Historical Jesus where I list 12.5 texts, many of them outside the New Testament, in the ancient world for the existence of Jesus. But one probably better example I would use, some say, yeah, but you're a Christian. Okay, Bart Ehrman, an atheist New Testament scholar, Bart Ehrman gives 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus within 100 years. Now, 100 years is actually kind of strict, but it's a nice, narrow parameter for saying Jesus lived. 100, and here's an atheist, 100 years time, 15 different sources.
But Bart Ehrman is still a Christ mythicist. He does not believe that there was a man who walked on water and rose from the dead. He's not the Christ, who's the Messiah, the redemption for all mankind.
Evidencing Jesus' death. If he died, he had to have lived. So Bart Ehrman calls that one of the two best evidences we have for that Jesus lived in history. The other one is that Paul is the best New Testament reference we have. Critics talk about half of Paul's epistles, 7 out of 13, being accredited, and you can use.
Why is Paul the best? I'm glad Habermas admits this, but why is Paul the best evidence? Because he's the only guy who identifies himself in the first person, writes with his own hand, that he had this idea, vision, experience of the resurrected Jesus. You won't find that in the Gospels. You might find that in 1 Peter, but even that's debated. And even in 1 Peter, it doesn't say that. 1 Peter doesn't say, I was a witness to the bodily resurrection of Jesus. He says he's the witness of the sufferings of Jesus. And this is something that a lot of Christians don't really get, that nowhere within the text itself does it say that someone say, hey, my name isn't so-so, I'm writing this like Paul does, and I saw Jesus.
Them in arguing because they're great sources. Well, the best thing Paul gives us is that he was an eyewitness to the eyewitnesses. Paul in Galatians 1 and again in Galatians 2, he went to Jerusalem and got to know Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, then in Galatians 2, John. They're all together, and the topic they're discussing, as Paul tells us, is the nature of the gospel, to make sure they're all on the same page. And Paul concludes, yes, they're all on the same page. But here, that's two great sets of data for the existence of Jesus. 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus, and Paul knowing.
But we don't have 15 independent sources extra biblical for the resurrection, do we?
Himself, of course, Peter, James, and John, the big four. He knows all of them, and he can ask them whatever questions he wants to. What would Jesus look like when he was walking and talking in Galilee? So it would be like asking George Washington, or asking Thomas Jefferson, what was George like? Asking Adams and John Quincy Adams and Monroe and so on. What do you know about George? And then it'd be really cool if you could talk to Martha. And that's neat because we have the women's testimony for going to the tomb and so on. So
we don't have women's testimony.
You make a multifaceted case for George Washington being the first president of the United States. We can do the same thing with Jesus actually having existed. And as Bart Ehrman says, he knows of nobody, no accredited specialist in the field.
Okay, when I first heard this the first time, I'm going, what?
Field of religion, no matter how liberal, how atheist or whatever, none of them who have university, college, or
none of them
seminary positions, none of them teach that Jesus never lived. The guys
none of them
who teach it and claim to be scholars are people who don't have accredited degrees. He said with two exceptions.
He said none of them. No one. He said that twice, at least twice, maybe three times, except for two exceptions. Who are these two exceptions? I'm thinking probably Robert Price and Richard Carrier. Robert Price has 2 PhDs.
Is Bart's count. The rest do not have accredited degrees, and none of them have university positions.
Why are they making such a big...
And none of them have university positions. Yeah, none of them are free from that statement of faith that they have to sign to keep their jobs. Okay, let's go back to Pete Enns. This is another... So guys like Gary Habermas, they're paid money, and same with Cameron Bertuzzi, he's paid money to raise the confidence for Christianity. I'm paid money to lower the confidence in Christianity, but they get paid probably more than I do because I don't ask for money like they do. But Pete Enns makes a great comment here that he is totally fine with being what's called an agnostic Christian, just like I call myself an agnostic atheist. But agnostic is not an adjective to the word atheist. It's just agnostic and atheist.
There's this line toward the end of Matthew's gospel after if life of faith, where doubt, let me put it this way, I don't think you can be anything other than an agnostic Christian in an intellectual sense. You can't. You have to admit that. You cannot just lock it all down. The Bible doesn't even lock it all down.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
Praise God. I just went evangelical on you. Praise God. It's just, I don't know.
You can't be sure. You can't be even 99% confident. You have to be agnostic about the Bible, about Christianity.
That's why I don't get bored doing this stuff, you know?
mhm. Yeah, I mean, listening to you, I agree with everything you said. It's like what's it? Music to my ears.
Yeah, music to my ears too, that type of humility. Hey, thank you, Titanicus, for the donation. Here's some Bertuzzi money. Yeah, you take some Bertuzzi money and give it to me. Okay, let's go back to Habermas here.
Big splash, do you think?
Probably because they infiltrate almost every website there is and have a bunch of, they have a loud presence. Whatever side you're on, recently there was a choice for Supreme Court justice in this country. How come the voices that made it on the news shows were the little chattering voices that ran next to the senators and got up in their ear and chirped at him and wouldn't let them sit down at the table?
Yeah, I honestly don't even know why Christians talk about mythicism so much. I guess there's so much at stake, because if mythicism is right, of Jesus, not the Christ, but of Jesus, then it's all over for them. For non-Christians, it's irrelevant. Whether Jesus existed or not, who cares to us? The real question is the Christ. Did the Christ exist? Because the Christ is the Redeemer. Jesus is just a person, a man. So the Christ is, the God in flesh idea.
Tables, and because that kind of thing makes the news. And people, and when they say, oh no, and they pretend like they're scholars, and they don't have any training, they haven't been in the field, and all the other scholars, atheists even, like Bart Ehrman, say they're wrong. So to me, that's the real test. It's not just Christians saying they're wrong. It's not Christian scholars saying they don't have a chance.
So Gary, what in your mind is the value in apologetics ministries like Capturing Christianity? Are they important? Do you think that we need more of them? What's your
Well,
value?
I think they're probably, I'd have to say they're very important. I would have to say the more informed they are, the more factual they are, the more they are. We don't want Christians who are chirping like the chirpers on the other side who are not scholars or whatever. But the better they know their field and the better they know what they're doing, I think apologetic groups do a tremendous pre-evangelistic kind of work.
Yeah, I disagree. The question is basically, why is apologetics important? Does it help with evangelism? I'm here to say it can be good for evangelism, but there's a huge problem. And the problem is, okay, let me ask it this way. Gary Habermas type Christians, would you agree that apologetics has really ramped up in the last 10 years? Would you agree that that's a fair statement, reasonable statement, that apologetic books, apologetic YouTube channels, apologetic podcasts, a lot of young Christians starting their own apologetic social media channels and so forth, it's really ramped up the last 10 years, wouldn't you agree? And look what's happening. Look what's happening. Evangelical, born-again Christians, the type that Gary Habermas is, in 2009, there was 86 million of them in this country, in the United States. In 2019, 82 million. Now, these evangelicals, they have babies. They procreate almost as much as Mormons and Muslims and African Americans. Not quite. They pump those babies out. And they raise them right, mostly. They teach them, for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Pumping out babies, teaching Jesus from a very early age, and yet dropped. What's going on? And apologetics has been ramping up. from my estimations, 10 million evangelicals in the last 10 years have left Christianity, even after all those births. I've even adjusted for deaths and emigration, all that stuff. 16 million out of the mainline churches. Yeah, because they're not teaching the true gospel, right? Catholics, 10 million out. Oh, that's because they're not teaching the true gospel. And then some Mormons and Muslims are leaving as well. And look what's happening. The nuns, atheists, and agnostics are gaining all that market share. What's going on? Now, you see the data. Does the data fit the statement that apologetics is great for evangelism when it's been ramping up? Well, correlation is not causation, right?
Where sometimes you have to sow the seed out in the field before it sprouts up, and to use Paul's phrase, and when it sprouts is not exactly the same form as when it was put in the ground. I think we have to critique other views, sometimes slowly, and you build layers on the data, and you work at it like that. And sometimes it takes people, as you know, years to finally think it's the true message. But I think there's a value, even if people never come to Christ from those sorts of exercises. I think it's very important to strengthen Christians who have doubts, to strengthen Christians who want to be bold in their witness.
Why is a doubting Christian a bad thing? Why can't you rest in the uncertainty that Pete Enns can rest in? Is it because you have a different personality type? Is it because you have this angst and anxiety and depression maybe? Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you're just conceited and arrogant and dogmatic and stubborn. I don't know. I don't know the answers to these questions. But it's just amazing to me to see the difference between a man like Gary Habermas and a man like Pete Enns. Let's go back to Pete Enns here. So talking about, I just showed all the people who are leaving Christianity, Gary Habermas's version of Christianity, as well as all the other versions. And this is Pete Enns' take on what to do or how to handle it. Let's see if I can find it. I got so many windows open right now. My system's lagging. I have a powerful computer, but I don't have powerful video cards. Okay, let's see.
In the Bible, couldn't stand it. This is a young person. This isn't somebody 30 or 40, young person. And that you have to take Bible courses at Eastern. And she took a course with one of my colleagues. And one of the things we're pointing out is essentially the contradictory nature of the Gospels. And not to slam it home, but just it's obvious you have to deal with this stuff. And her faith was actually invigorated by that. And she said, it's so nice just to see that these writers were trying to do something and they weren't trying to do it the same way. In fact, they're using each other and saying, no, I'm going to change that to say something else. And for some reason, that struck her in a way that was faith supporting and not detrimental to faith. Again, apologists might not see much sense in that story, but she apprehended something of God through that experience.
Okay, now this is amazing to me because a lot of, I think, youth, Gary Habermas type Christians have left Christianity because they see the contradictions. And I know there's Christians screaming, I can harmonize, I can resolve all those contradictions. But I think even Christians admit that there's some biggies out there. And the big ones are sovereignty versus free will, Calvinism versus non-Calvinism, why Jesus even had to die at all if it says in the Old Testament that God can forgive without sacrifice. There's some big ones out there that I think even intelligent pastors and apologists would admit to, that they don't have it all figured out either. But someday when they get to heaven, they'll get the answers. And Pete Enns is saying, look, there's a brand of Christianity out there that revel in these paradoxes, these contradictions, and it actually makes them stronger. But I don't think guys like Gary Habermas can do that. I think their brand of Christianity is more, if we can't trust it, if there are errors and contradictions, then we can't trust it, and then it becomes a house of cards. Now, I'm not saying that's exactly Gary Habermas's position. He's more of a mere Christianity type guy, but yet as we saw in this video, he piles on so much more than just the mere Christianity stuff. Hey, thank you so much, Heath Farley, for the donation for the video card fund. Yeah, well, the problem is I don't have a power supply to even get better. I would have to change out my power supply too. But anyhow, let's go back to, actually, let's leave it with Gary Habermas. He's almost done here.
So I think apologetic organizations, the better ones, the better they are, the better it is. And they pave a path in our culture that is really, really important because of how quickly our culture is moving away from the Christian.
Well, I agree with him there. It is moving, according to the last Pew poll, it's moving way faster. And even the evangelical born again, I have yet to see a Christian like Gary Habermas respond to the latest Pew poll because it's devastating for them. I mean, they used to think that they're holding their own and making gains, and that's not true. The evangelicals are losing market share almost as fast as the mainline churches now. Hey, thank you so much for the donation, Tony D. Don't religious people understand that debating religions like arguing over what color the string is that holds up our planet? Well, Christians like Pete Enns get it. He said that, if you came late, Tony D., he said that at the very beginning, that it's almost like children playing in the playground, talking about these arguments and evidence and so forth. To him, he revels in the mystery. But for Christians like Gary Habermas, the Michael Laconas of the world, no, they can't see it. It's like their meaning, their hope, afterlife, all this hinges upon it.
Preaching.
Do you have any tips for aspiring Christian apologists?
I'd say know your field very, very well. Do a lot of reading. Be able to interact with both sides. And that means know what the other side's saying too, and know what the Christians are saying. Be ready with a quick answer.
That is horrible advice for some Christians. Knowing the other side, knowing it well, this has led to a lot of people leaving Christianity. And I think even Christians admit this. There's many examples. Bart Ehrman is an example of knowing the other side well, and so well that he ends up leaving Christianity. So this advice can be good for some Christians, but for other Christians, it means they're going to leave Christianity. This is why I think apologetics is, dare I say, hurting more than helping and causing the deconversions out of even born-again evangelical Christianity, as I showed in the Pew poll recently.
Sure. Not to be afraid to speak up and to always try to draw.
But thank you so much for the generous donation, Tony D.
Or to make a bridge between the message and what it should make in people's lives. For example, when someone dies, Paul says, we grieve. You think about Jesus weeping at Lazarus' grave. Paul says, we grieve, but not as those without hope. So a hopeful grieving is a lot different than a grieving without hope. So those are times.
A hopeful grieving is better. This is one I struggle with. Part of me thinks Gary Habermas is right here. It's like, who would you rather have at your deathbed? Me, who's an atheist, who believe that when we die we become worm food, or Gary Habermas, who says you'll get to see your loved ones again in streets of gold. Maybe. I don't know if he believes actual streets in gold, but I do see why some Christians or some people in general would say, I'd rather have Gary Habermas on my deathbed than you, Doug. I get that. But at what point do we say, we got to face reality? And maybe sometimes it helps with the grieving process when we see death for what it is. It's final. And knowing that when you're dead, you're not going to miss anything. You're not going to have any regrets. You're not going to be thinking about your legacy. You're not going to be thinking about anything. You know why? Because you're dead. Yeah. Maybe I should go to hospices. Okay, last clip for Pete Enns. PineCreek visits the hospice. Who here wants to hear the truth? You're going to be worm food in 48 hours.
Well, I have to allow them the space too that I would allow others.
Oh, the question is, how do you talk? This was my question today to Pete Enns, and Tom asked it. What's the best way to talk to fundamentalists like Gary Habermas? What's the best way to communicate with these guys?
And to know that whether they realize it or not, they're actually on a journey as well. And I want to respect where they are. So I'm not going to come at them and say, hey, by the way, pal, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, and it's contradictory, and there's stuff in the Gospels that Jesus probably didn't say or do. I'm not.
There's things in the Gospels that Jesus probably didn't say or do. Coming from a Christian. Don't you love it? Moses probably didn't exist. There's things in the Gospels that Jesus probably never said or did. And this guy loves Jesus, and he's a Christian.
I'm not going to start with that, but I want to sort of let them know that I could be a safe person that they might disagree with, because the day may come when they may have questions and they may be looking for another paradigm, and I want to be there to sort of help them with that as well. So I really don't talk to. I try not to pick fights with fundamentalists. Sometimes it's hard, but I try not to. And I feel like when they're ready, they know where they can find me, and we can talk about stuff.
When they're ready, they know where to find me. Those are fighting words. They know where I live. If they want to talk to me. If Gary Habermas, I would love. How many people here would pay money to see Pete Enns have a debate with Gary Habermas? That would be glorious. I might even become a Christian just to see that.
I've been invited to debates with apologists. There's no way on this earth I'm going to do that, because we're never going to get past the first sentence, because I'm going to deconstruct the whole process, right? That's why I'm not going to do that either. I'm not going to get into it with fundamentalists, because they're not going to change their mind because I have a better argument. If they're going to ever change, it's going to have to start with an experience they've had.
It's going to have to start with an experience. Yes, and I agree with that. I think, and PineCreek has very high standards for experiences. So if I'm going to become a Christian, it has to start with an experience that has a very high bar. And that bar is amputee getting his limb back, or my favorite, my sister, who I've known my whole life, who's dying, paralyzed with MS. I know her situation. I know there's no funny business if she was to be healed. And so does so many others. Complete healing from her MS. Going from a feeding tube paralyzed to complete, like that's akin to an amputee getting his limb back, because she would have to get all that muscle mass that she's lost for the last, 7-8 years, being paralyzed. Totally.
That drives them to think about the nature of reality differently.
Yeah, and that would drive me to think of the nature of reality differently. It would have to be something as clear as this pen falling. Old, ancient texts are not going to cut it for most people. In fact, I would say the vast majority of people, even people like Gary Habermas, I would bet there's something that happened to him in his life, well, plus being raised in it, I'm sure, that these experiences he has looked at and said, there's a supernatural realm, look at all the minimal facts.
Yeah, it's really good. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been great. Great listening and talking.
Yeah, it was a really great conversation with T-Jump. Go check out his channel. I'm getting tired, so I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to start the music. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, I've got 2 minutes to ask them. Tag me. Questions or comments? Aaron asks or says, I really wanted to hear Blake thinks about Moses existing. Blake Giunta? I'm pretty confident that Blake Giunta is very, very, very conservative. He believes the flood happened. He believes Moses existed, Abraham existed, all that stuff. He believes in, I'm quite confident he believes in spiritual warfare. You're welcome, Titanicus. Thanks for being here. Good to see you here, Susan. Reed says, make your models more mature, Christians. Future testable predictions or be ignored. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Dickinson. Yeah. Christians, just have the Church of Acts repeat itself today. That's what you need. Repeatable miracles. Aaron asked, did Cam say Habermas' own survey of historians had it at 70 to 30% on historical Jesus, or am I... No. No, I think you're misunderstanding. I think it's historians, New Testament historians are roughly divided if whether or not the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, but I don't think it's even, I think it's like the majority of historians, but not about the historicity of Jesus. Thank you, Kevin. Good to see you here. I don't remember seeing your name before, have I? Trevor Lund, I always thought PineCreek's computer ran on the power of the Holy Spirit. Well, the Lord told me that my video cards are failing. My apologies to Gary Habermas and Pete Enns. They were both scheduled to come on and debate tonight, but we ran out of time. Have a great evening, guys.